Imagine you've stolen a neighbor's sheep. Maybe you were hungry, or maybe you just wanted to see if you could get away with it. In medieval England, they'd cut off your hand, while in Frankish lands, you might be hanged on the spot. But in Viking Scandinavia, you'd be taken to a field, surrounded by your entire community, and judged not by a king, not by a priest, but by a circle of ordinary farmers who had the power to decide whether you lived, died, or simply ceased to exist. That last option, by the way, was considered the worst of the three. The Vikings were not what you think they were, and their justice system is worse than you think. Before we get to the punishments, you need to understand how Viking law actually worked, because this is where it gets interesting. The Vikings had no kings making decrees from thrones, no royal judges, and no professional lawyers, at least not in the way we think of them. Instead, they had the Thing. The Thing from the Old Norse Thing was a public assembly where every free man in the community was expected to show up, held outdoors in a designated field at regular intervals throughout the year. This was the court, this was the parliament, and this was the closest thing the Viking world had to a legal system. If someone wronged you, stole from you, attacked you, or killed a member of your family, you didn't go to the authorities. You brought your case to the Thing. You stood up in front of your community to make your argument, the accused did the same, and then the gathered men voted. There were regional things for local disputes, and for the biggest cases, the ones that affected entire regions, there was the Althing, which in Iceland was held every summer and became one of the oldest functioning parliaments in human history, established around 930 AD. So right away, we have to throw out the image of Vikings as lawless savages, as these were people who built legal institutions sophisticated enough to last centuries, even if the punishments those institutions handed down were a completely different story. Let's start at the bottom and work our way up. Fines. Most minor crimes in Viking society were handled with fines, meaning assault, theft, and property damage all had set prices attached to them. The fine varied depending on the severity of the act and the social status of the victim. The social status of the victim mattered, so harming a wealthy landowner cost you more than harming a poor farmer, making the system systematic even if it wasn't equal. Fines were paid in silver, livestock, or goods, and if you couldn't pay, your family might cover it. But if no one covered it, things got much worse. Corporal punishment. For more serious crimes, or for people who couldn't pay their fines, physical punishment was on the table, including flogging or mutilation like cutting off a hand or an ear, which appeared in certain legal codes as Viking society absorbed more Christian influence over time. But here's the thing. Corporal punishment was relatively rare in the earlier pagan Viking period. The preferred tools of Viking justice were social and economic, not physical. Which brings us to the punishment that Vikings themselves feared most: outlawry. This was the Viking world's most dreaded sentence, and it's unlike anything in modern law. To be declared an outlaw, utlagi in Old Norse, meant you were expelled from human society entirely, not just from your village or your region, but from humanity itself, legally speaking. An outlaw had no rights and no protections, meaning anyone, literally anyone, could kill you on sight and face zero legal consequences. And because you couldn't own property or make contracts, you couldn't even ask for food or shelter without risking punishment for those who helped you. You were, in the eyes of Viking law, no longer a person. There were two levels of outlawry. Lesser outlawry meant exile for 3 years, after which you could return and attempt to reintegrate, while full outlawry was permanent, casting you out forever to be hunted like an animal and erased. Many outlaws fled to the uninhabited wilderness, like the highlands of Iceland or the deep forests of Norway, where some formed outlaw bands while others simply died alone. One of the most famous outlaws in Viking history was Eric the Red, the same Eric the Red who later discovered Greenland after being declared an outlaw in Iceland for killing several men in a series of feuds. Rather than be hunted down, he sailed west into the unknown. Where he didn't find death, he found a continent. Outlawry, unintentionally, helped populate the North Atlantic. Now here's the part of Viking justice that gets genuinely dark. The Thing could hand down verdicts, but the Thing couldn't always enforce them. Viking society had no police force, no sheriffs, and no standing army of law enforcement, so if a man was found guilty and ordered to pay a fine but refused, what happened next was largely up to the victim's family. This gave rise to the blood feud. If someone killed your father and the Thing failed to provide adequate justice, or if the killer simply fled, it was your right, and in many ways your duty to seek vengeance personally, which meant you could kill the killer and his family could then come for you, and on it went. The sagas are full of these cycles, with generations of families locked in mutual destruction where each act of vengeance was legally justifiable, each one producing the next. Viking society was acutely aware of this problem. One of the primary functions of the thing was to interrupt these cycles to provide a legal framework through which disputes could be resolved without endless bloodshed. Compensation payments in particular were designed to give victims' families something other than violence to satisfy their grievance. It worked, sometimes. Let's end on some of the stranger corners of Viking justice, because there are a few. Nidingur, the social death. Beyond legal outlawry, Vikings had a concept called ned, a form of social shaming so severe it was almost a parallel punishment system. To be called a Nidingur was to be labeled a coward, a deviant, or a man without honor. This wasn't just an insult, it was a legal accusation. And in Viking society, where reputation was everything, being marked as a Nidingur could destroy a man as thoroughly as any fine or exile, leading men to kill each other over it as the law actually recognized these accusations as justification for violence. Trial by combat. When evidence was unclear and both parties maintained their innocence, Viking law allowed for holmganga, or ritual single combat. Two men would enter a small marked-off space, sometimes literally an island or a hide on the ground, with specific rules about weapons, shields, and substitutes, where the winner was, by definition, the one telling the truth, or at least the one favored by the gods. It sounds primitive, but within its own logic, it was a legitimate and regulated legal mechanism, taken seriously enough that professional fighters were sometimes hired as substitutes, which predictably created its own set of problems. Viking justice was brutal, yes, but it was also structured, communal, and in many ways shockingly modern in its instincts, featuring public courts, representative judgment, and a focus on compensation over pure punishment. What it lacked was enforcement. And in that gap between the law as written and the law as lived, you find blood feuds, outlaws sailing toward unknown continents, and men killing each other over words. Not so different from any other age, really.